So there's been a lot of talk about this Safety Act that's coming out of Illinois, and a lot of people are referring to it as the new Purge Law. And there's a lot of reasons why people are concerned about this situation. But I think we should talk about why we need to adapt to these kinds of laws rather than just be opposed to them. Because you have to understand that this is the trajectory the country's on in many ways, and we have to adapt to our environment and use it to our advantage where we can and change our perspective once in a while based on the fact that things aren't exactly how they have always been now, are they? So, the Safety Act begins January 1st, 2023, and it basically gets rid of cash bail. There's a lot of other things that are part of the Safety Act, but this is the part that people seem to be the most concerned about. So, that's why we're going to discuss it. Now, it gets rid of cash bail for 12 different non-detainable offenses, which is just some terminology that's being thrown around out there. But here's some of the charges that could still let somebody out without any cash bail involved: second-degree murder, arson, drug-induced homicide, robbery, kidnapping, aggravated battery, burglary, intimidation, aggravated driving under the influence, fleeing and eluding, drug offenses, and threatening a public official. Now, not every single one of these crimes means that somebody gets out scot-free. Basically, the prosecution has to prove that there's a clear and convincing amount of evidence that this person that they have detained will either continually be a threat to somebody in particular or have a high flight risk. And if any of those things can be met, then that person can still be detained for those crimes. So these aren't necessarily get out of jail free type crimes, but there are some concerns related to this whole situation for obvious reasons, okay? So let's talk about the negatives first, all right? So here's the negatives, and this is why most people are upset about it, okay? There's less risk, and it emboldens people to act in a criminal manner. Because basically, by committing these crimes, there's a good chance you might just be let out. And at that point in time, regardless of how the court feels about it or how you feel about it, that gives someone an opportunity to either commit more crime or to escape, right? Or to evade, flee, whatever you want to call it. So all that concern is there for a reason. People are very worried about what this means for emboldening criminals. Now, my counterpoint to that situation, especially related to Illinois and in particularly Chicago, is that I would say the criminals there are already emboldened and already feel like there's no risk. Even though cash bail still might exist in other parts of the country, these prosecutors and these district attorneys are still just letting people out anyway. And nobody's necessarily feeling the consequences of their actions any longer. So a lot of this is already happening regardless of this Safety Act. Now, we'll see if things actually spike once January 1st, 2023 rolls around. But basically, I'm just trying to say that although this can embolden people to act more criminally, I feel like they already are. Now, let's talk about why we should adapt to this, okay? Understand that there's a lot of push towards this kind of stuff. And part of it should be understandable in one way or the other because it shows that our authority, our federal government, our state governments, our local governments, and the police departments and the authorities and the courts within are probably just not able to keep up any longer with what's going on. The justice system is failing in many ways. So understand that this is all part of the house of cards kind of tumbling apart. But here's what you need to adapt for. Here's some positives to keep in mind regarding this situation. And when I say positives, you're going to say, wait a second, what are you talking about, Magic Prepper? Positives, we're talking about criminals here who are doing terrible things like second-degree murder and arson and drug-induced homicide and stuff like that. Well, let's talk about why this is something that you should consider in the sense of a positive, all right? So first and foremost, for a lot of these crimes, you won't be held against your will any longer just because you can't afford the bail. Now, understand that when you get arrested, if you're being charged with something, you may or may not have actually committed that crime. And the thing you really have to keep in mind, and this is where you should at least have some understanding, is that what a lot of people are saying they're okay with is the idea if you get charged with second-degree murder, right, and you're a rich person that can afford a $250,000 bail, you should just be able to leave. But if I'm poor and I'm charged with the same crime, whether or not I committed it, since the court has not even seen me yet, this is all pre-trial, correct? Well, I can't leave because I don't have $250,000 or even $25,000 in order to utilize a bail bond. So understand that this is what this is. It's getting rid of that cash requirement so that the poor guy and the rich guy can both leave at the same time, regardless of whether or not someone has resources. Now, understand why that matters, because Here's the thing you really have to keep in mind. The way things are going, the way we're moving forward here as a country is that you, me, people like us, we are being labeled criminals. And in many ways, we're going to find ourselves becoming criminals very soon, in my opinion at least, especially if you see what's happening with the ATF and everything related to the Second Amendment. And then you see what's happening with the whole militia violent extremist labeling that's being put on all people who just want to be more self-reliant and be left alone. So yeah, we are becoming these criminals that everybody's so worried about. So you have to adapt to this environment and understand that this might be something you may have to take advantage of. Now, here's the other thing you really have to consider when it comes to the positives here, right? Less risk for good people who are doing things like defending themselves, all right? Modern problems require modern solutions. Well, in a lot of these places, especially in Illinois, people aren't necessarily allowed to defend themselves to the full degree that they should be able to. But with laws like this, well, at least there's some leeway in the sense of what you may or may not be charged with and what you may or may not be able to be detained by. So, what am I trying to say here? Well, let's use this example, a real world example where somebody defended themselves, were charged with a crime, were held, detained, and then couldn't leave without the help of many others around them in order to afford the bail, all right? So there's a bodega clerk in New York City who was charged with second-degree murder because he stabbed a man fatally that attacked him within his bodega, all right? He said it was self-defense. Of course, his attorneys argued that it was self-defense, but he was charged with second-degree murder, which is one of the non-detainable offenses on this list. Now, he spent 5 days on Rikers Island and had to post a $50,000 bail before being released. So he was detained for 5 days. He had to come out of pocket minimum $5,000 in order to get a bail bond to post $50,000 worth of bail. The original bail amount was actually $250,000, which was negotiated down by his attorneys. And still, regardless, he was spent 5 days on Rikers Island against his will. And the best part about this story is that the charges were actually dismissed. They were eventually dismissed because of the evidence that came out, the video evidence and everything surrounded it, where the state decided that he actually did act in self-defense. So you have a situation where you have a good person who defended themselves and had to do it in a way that created a fatal scenario for someone else, and then had to spend 5 days of their life detained, and then had to spend thousands of dollars of their own money to get out. And then eventually it was found out that they, in fact, were not guilty of anything. Now, you can understand why this is going to be a big deal for people like you and I if we ever find ourselves in a self-defense situation, especially here with crime getting rampant. And yes, will this embolden criminals? I think that's a valid point you can make. But will people need to defend themselves more and more if that's the case? Of course. And do the laws protect people like you and I when it comes to that? They don't really. So these are things you really have to keep in mind based on our future trajectory. I'm just trying to put some stuff out there because there's a lot of things going on about how crazy this law is and how this whole purge situation is suddenly going to exist. But you have to look at it from the perspective of a prepper and say, I can adapt to what's happening and use these things and take advantage of them if need be. Plus, keep in mind what else is listed as non-detainable offenses, okay? You never know. If you're going to find yourself in a position as a prepper, as a Minuteman, as somebody who might refer to themselves as some kind of patriot or whatever you want to call it. But you never know when you might find yourself in a scenario where fleeing and eluding becomes a necessity and intimidation is something you might have to do in order to maintain your security or OPSEC, and who knows if anybody would ever have to threaten a public official, which I thought was an interesting one for them to put on that list, considering the public officials are the ones who made this act, right? So all of these things have to be looked at with a keen eye. You can't overreact and throw all of your emotions behind a situation like this without considering how it can be used to your advantage or what you might need to adapt to considering the environment that it's being born out of, all right? Now, look, in order to survive the way things are going, you have to get crafty. Being crafty and clever is going to save a lot of people's lives. But you have to also understand that for a long, long time, and this is just a fact, this is just the way things work, and it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. For a very long time, if you were poor and either committed a crime or didn't commit a crime, get that fly out of my face, and got arrested and detained for it, well, you really didn't have a way out. You just had to sit in jail and rot. And you know what a lot of times would happen? You would lose your job, you would suddenly be behind on bills, you would find yourself in debt, and a lot of times might have ruined your life, and you may be completely innocent. But if you were extremely rich or well connected and you did commit a crime and you're a terrible person, but the law is the law and it says, your bail is $200,000 and you had 20 grand in the bank, well, you're out. No problem at all, even if you're a terrible person. And while this innocent guy who's poor sits in jail, you're out drinking martinis and eating caviar, right? So keep in mind that these things are aren't they're not always fair, okay? I wasn't exactly sure what I was trying to say right there, but you get my drift, all right? But the biggest takeaway of this video should be that there are some things here that might actually be beneficial to you as well. And although you can't necessarily change the environment around you, you can't change the trajectory that we're on because this whole boat is going down in a bad way and I don't like it, but that's what we're doing. Well, you better adapt to that situation. I swear to God, this fly. And you better come out on top because of it. So hopefully this gave you some things to think about, and hopefully this takes some of the people who are on the edge of the cliff about this whole purge law and change that perspective as to how this could really pan out and why it might actually exist. Look, I'm not trying to be political or anything here. I'm trying to approach this thing from a prepper standpoint, somebody who's willing to find the loopholes if need be. So without anything else to say about this, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.